Hello there! In the previous episode, we created a moving enemy. In this episode, we are going to create an obstacle that will prevent the player from reaching the goal unless he pulls the lever. Also, we will learn to use switch statements. Let's get started. Drag the finished prefab somewhere on the scene. Next, select Switch Sprite from the Sprites folder. Change the sprite mode to multiple and hit Apply. Then open the sprite editor and slice the image. The cell size is 128 by 128. When you're done, click Apply and close the editor. Next, expand the Ground 2 sprite and drag these thin ground platform pieces to the scene. You can create as long platform as you want. When you're done, put the pieces inside of an empty game object and give the object a collider and assign it to the ground layer. Then drag the first frame of the switch sprite into the scene and place it on the platform you created. Rename it as switch and change the order in layer value to -1. Next, we will create animations for it. They will be really simple. While switch is selected, press Create from the animation window. Name the clip as Switch Idle. Then drag the first frame into the timeline. This animation is now done. Next, create a new animation clip and name it as Switch Pressed. Then drag the last frame on top of the timeline. Great! Both of the animations are now ready. Select the Switch Pressed animation from the Animations folder and switch off the Loop Time checkbox. And next, open the Animator window. Create a new parameter, which is the type of trigger, and name it as Pressed. Then create a transition from idle to pressed and give it the condition you just created. Check off the Exit Time checkbox and change the transition duration to 0.03. Now the transitions are done. Return to Scene View. Give the switch a Box Collider 2D component and activate the Is Trigger option. The size of the collider can be bigger than the actual lever is, so that we can see the animation. Otherwise, the player will be in front of it and we can't see it. Next, we need to add a tag to the switch. Create a tag called Switch and assign it to the game object. Okay, this game object is now ready. Now it's time to create the obstacle. Drag the obstacle sprite to the scene and set its order in layer to -1. Then, change the layer from default to ground. Next, we need to give the obstacle two components: Box Collider 2D and Rigid Body 2D. Go ahead and add them. Then change the rigid body's body type to kinematic. We do this because we want that the stone pillar can't be affected by physics forces such as gravity or the player colliding into it. Okay, now it's time to jump into code. Create a new script called obstacle mover and attach it to the obstacle. What we will do is that when the lever gets pulled by the player, this obstacle will slowly move downwards until it's out of sight, and then we will deactivate the whole game object. Let's define few variables first. Write private float timer. Then under it, write hide in inspector in square brackets, public pool switch activated. We use hide in inspector because we don't want this variable to be shown in the inspector, but we need it to be public so that we can access it from the player script later. Lastly, write private rigid body 2D RB. Now, in start function, we need to set these variables' values. Write RB equals to get component rigid body 2D. Then under it, switch activated equals to false and timer equals to 0F. Next, let's change update into fixed update. Now we need to think how to make this obstacle move after the lever is pulled. First of all, the switch activated boolean needs to be true. So, write if switch activated. Then we want to move the obstacle for a certain amount of time until it's out of sight. So we will start the timer. Write timer plus equals to time dot delta time. Time dot delta time calculates the time between the current and previous frame. So when we keep adding that time into this float, the value keeps increasing and therefore it can act as a timer. This plus equals combination is called the addition assignment operator. It is a shorter way to write timer equals to timer plus time dot delta time. Alright, our timer is now running. What's next? Then we need to check if some amount of time has passed and do something. Write if timer is smaller than 7F. And inside of this if statement, write rb.velocity equals to new vector 2, 0f minus 0.7f. Now, if more than 7 seconds have passed, the obstacle needs to be deactivated. So, write else, curly brackets, and inside of them, switch activated equals to false, and under it, game object dot set active equals to false. Now this game object will deactivate it after moving for 7 seconds. Click Save and switch to player script. Here we need to write two variables which will store the switch and the obstacle. Write public animator switch anim and under it public game object obstacle. Then in start, we will find the animator component of the switch. Write if game object dot find game object with tag switch. Then inside of the if statement, write switch anim equals to game object dot find game object with tag switch dot get component animator. The reason why we don't write this line without the if statement is that it will result in an error when there is no switch in the scene. But now Unity will try to store this component only in the case if it can find a game object with this tag from the scene. Then let's do the same for the obstacle. This time we need to refer to its name since it doesn't have a tag. Write if game object dot find obstacle. Make sure that you write exactly the same as the game object has. Then inside of the if statement, write obstacle equals to GameObject.findObstacle. Next, head to onTrigger Enter. Under the other if statements, write ifother.GameObject.tag two equality signs switch. Then we want to activate the animation and also initiate the movement of the obstacle. Write switchAnim.setTriggerPressed. And under it, write obstacle.getComponent obstacleMover.switchActivated equals to true. Okay, let's test if this works. Wonderful! The animation works and the obstacle starts to move downwards. However, it disappears before it gets behind the ground. Let's get back to Obstacle Mover script and fix this. Here in the if statement, we need to expand the time limit. Change it to 12. Let's test if this is better. Great! Now it goes behind the ground completely. Awesome work! We have made an obstacle that can be removed by touching the switch. There is one thing we could do before ending though. It's concerning the if statements in onTrigger Enter function. Open the player script. During this course, we will be adding a lot of similar if statements where we check for the tag of the game object that collides with the player. There is an alternative for this and it's called the switch statement. A switch statement is good for comparing a single variable to a series of constants. In our case, we compare whether the name of the tag is enemy or finish or switch and so on. Let's start to write the code and examine it during the process. Above the if statements, write switch in parentheses. In the parentheses, we need to write the name of the variable we want to compare. In our case, the common thing to all these if statements is the tag of the other game object. So, inside of the parentheses, write other.gameObject.tag in curly brackets. The way a switch statement works is that it goes through different cases. Write case, enemy in double quotes, and finally a colon at the end. Then copy the code from the if statement and paste it under the case. To make an end to this case, we need to write break and semicolon below the code we just pasted. Here we have our first case. Break is a jump statement which moves the code execution away from the switch statement so that the other cases are not executed. Now, write cases for finish and switch according to this example and remember to copy the code from the corresponding if statements. When you're done, you can delete the if statements. We will be adding more cases later in coming episodes. Finally, we should save the script and test the game to be sure that everything works. Everything seems to be working. The last thing to do is to drag the switch and the obstacle to the prefabs folder. Alright, now we're done. Now we have a switch and an obstacle that we can use in level design. Also, we learned to use switch statement in code. In the next episode, we will create a spring that bounces the player high when stepped on. Remember to save the scene. See you again.